We come to chapter 43 of Charles Dickens' novel Nicholas Nickleby. You may remember at the end of chapter 42, Nicholas, along with John Browdie and his wife Tilly, had a somewhat aggressive confrontation with Fanny Squeers and her father, Mr. Wackford Squeers, Jenny's brother. Fanny's brother, young Wackford, was present as well, but he was busy helping himself to the food laid out for tea. Food, however, was least of the concerns of Fanny and her father. They were intent on exposing the wickedness, as they saw it, of Nicholas and John Browdie in helping Smike to escape from their clutches and threatening to take him back by fair means or foul. After a torrent of insults from Fanny to Tilly, the confrontation ended with Fanny, her father, and young Wackford sweeping out of the room and promising all kinds of vengeance, both legal and otherwise. So we come to chapter 43. The storm had long given place to a calm the most profound, and the evening was pretty far advanced indeed. Supper was over, and the process of digestion proceeding as favourably as, under the influence of complete tranquillity, cheerful conversation, and a moderate allowance of brandy and water, most wise men conversant with the anatomy and functions of the human frame will consider that it ought to have proceeded, when the three friends, that is, Nicholas, John Browdie, and Tilly, were startled by the noise of a loud and angry threatening below stairs at the Saracen's Head, where they were staying. It presently attained so high a pitch, and were conveyed beside in language so towering, sanguinary, and ferocious, that it could hardly have been surpassed if there had actually been a Saracen's Head then present in the establishment, supported on the shoulders and surmounting the trunk of a real, live, furious, and most unappeasable Saracen. This turmoil, instead of quickly subsiding after the first outburst, as turmoils not unfrequently do, whether in taverns, legislative assemblies, or elsewhere, into a mere grumbling and growling squabble, increased every moment. And although the whole din appeared to be raised by but one pair of lungs, such words as scoundrel, rascal, insolent puppy, and a variety of expletives no less flattering to the party addressed with great relish and strength of tone, that a dozen voices raised in concert under any ordinary circumstances would have made far less uproar and created much smaller consternation. "What's the matter?" said Nicholas, moving hastily towards the door. John Browdie was striding in the same direction when Mrs. Browdie turned pale and, leaning back in her chair, requested with a faint voice to take notice that if he ran into any danger, it was her intention to fall into hysterics immediately, and that the consequences might be more serious than thoughtful. John looked rather disconcerted by this intelligence, though there was a lurking grin on his face at the same time. But being quite unable to keep out of the fray, he compromised the matter by tucking his wife's arm under his own, and thus accompanied, following Nicholas downstairs with all speed. The passage outside the coffee-room door was the scene of the disturbance, and here were congregated the coffee-room customers, and waiters, together with 2 or 3 coachmen and helpers from the yard. These had hastily assembled around a young man who, from his appearance, might have been a year or 2 older than Nicholas, and who, besides having given utterance to the defiances just now described, seemed to have proceeded to an even greater length in his indignation, inasmuch as his feet had no longer covering with his slippers. He was simply wearing a pair of stockings. The slippers lay at no great distance from the head of a prostrate figure in an opposite corner, who bore the appearance of having been shot unto his present retreat by the means of a kick, and complimented by having the slippers flung about his ears afterwards. The coffee-room customers and the waiters and the coachman and the helpers, not to mention a barmaid, who, looking on from behind an open sash window, seemed at that moment, if a spectator might judge from their winks, nods, and muttered exclamations, strongly disposed to take part against the young gentleman in the stocking. Observing this, and that the young gentleman was nearly his own age and had nothing in appearance of an habitual brawler, Nicholas, impelled by such feelings as will influence young men sometimes, felt a very strong disposition to side with the weaker party, and so thrust himself at once into the centre of the group, and in a more emphatic tone, perhaps, than circumstances might seem to warrant, demanded what all the noise was about. "Hullo!" said one of the men from the yard. "This is somebody in disguise, this is." "Room for the eldest son of the Emperor of Russia, gentlemen," cried another fellow. Disregarding these sallies, which were uncommonly well received, as sallies at the expense of the best-dressed persons in the crowd usually are, Nicholas glanced carelessly round, and addressing the young gentleman, who had by this time picked up his slippers and thrust his feet into them, repeated his inquiries with a courteous air. The young gentleman replied, "A mere nothing." At this, a murmur was raised by the lookers-on, and some of the boldest cried, "Oh, indeed, was it, though? Nothing, eh? Oh, he called that nothing, did he? Lucky for him if he found it nothing." These and many other expressions of ironical disapprobation having been exhausted, 2 or 3 of the outdoor fellows began to hustle Nicholas and the young gentleman who had made the noise, stumbling against them by accident and treading on their toes, and so forth. But this being a round game, and not one necessarily limited to 3 or 4 players, was open to John Browdie too, who, bursting into the little crowd, to the great terror of his wife, and falling about in all directions, now to the right, now to the left, now forwards, now backwards, and accidentally diving his elbow through the hat of a tallest helper, who had been particularly active, speedily caused the odds to wear a very different appearance. While more than one stout fellow limped away to a respectful distance, anathematizing with tears in his eyes the heavy tread and ponderous feet of the burly Yorkshireman. "Just let me see him do it again," said he who had been kicked into the corner, rising as he spoke, apparently more from fear of John Browdie's inadvertently treading upon him than any desire to place himself on equal terms with his late adversary. "Just let me see him try to do it again, that's all." "Let me hear you make those remarks again," said the young gentleman, "and I'll knock that head of yours in amongst the wine glasses behind you there." Here a waiter, who had been rubbing his hands in excessive enjoyment of the scene so long as only the breaking of heads was in question, adjured the spectators with great earnestness to fetch the police, declaring that otherwise murder would be surely done, and that he was responsible for all the glass and china on the premises. "No need for anyone to stir himself," said the young gentleman. "I'm going to remain in the house all night, and shall be found here in the morning, if any assault is to answer for." "But why did you strike him in the first place?" said one of the bystanders. "Aye, why did you strike him? What did you strike him for?" demanded the others. The unpopular gentleman looked coolly round, and addressing himself to Nicholas, said, "You inquired just now what the matter was. The matter is simply this. Yonder person, who was drinking with a friend in the coffee-room when I took my seat there half an hour before going to bed, for I have just come off a journey and preferred stopping here tonight to going home at this hour, where I was not expected until tomorrow, chose to express himself in very disrespectful and insolently familiar terms of a young lady whom I recognized from his description and other circumstances, and with whom I have the honor to be acquainted." As he spoke loud enough to be overheard by the other guests who were present, I informed him most civilly that he was mistaken in his conjectures, which were of an offensive nature, but as he chose to renew his conversation when leaving the room in a more offensive strain than before, I could not refrain from making after him and facilitating his departure by a kick, which reduced him to the posture in which you saw him just now. "I am the best judge of my own affairs, I take it," said the young man, who had certainly not quite recovered from his recent heat. "If anybody here thinks it proper to make this quarrel his own, I have not the smallest earthly objection, I do assure them." Of all possible courses of proceeding under the circumstances detailed, there was certainly no one who, in his then state of mind, could have appeared more laudable to Nicholas than this young man. There were not many subjects of dispute which at that moment could have come home to his own breast more powerfully for having the unknown lady with whom he was so desperately in love uppermost in his mind. It naturally occurred to him that he would have done exactly the same thing had any audacious gossiper durst to presume in his hearing to speak lightly of her. Influenced by these considerations, he espoused the young gentleman's quarrel with great warmth, protesting that he had done quite right, and that he was to be respected for it, which John Browdie, albeit not quite clear as to the merits, immediately protested too, with not inferior vehemence. "Let him take care, that's all," said the defeated party, who was being rubbed down by a waiter after his recent fall on the dusty boards. "He don't knock me about for nothing, I can tell you. A pretty state of things if a man isn't allowed to admire a handsome girl without being beat to pieces for it." This reflection appeared to have great weight with the young lady in the bar, who, adjusting her cap as she spoke and glancing at a mirror, declared that it would be a very pretty state of things indeed, and that if people were to be punished for actions so innocent and natural as that, there would be more people to be knocked down than there would be people to knock them down. And then she wondered what the gentleman meant by it. That she did. "My dear girl," said the young gentleman in a low voice, advancing towards the sash window. "Nonsense, sir," replied the young lady sharply, smiling, though she turned aside and biting her lip, whereat Mrs. Browdie, who was still standing on the stairs, glanced at her with disdain and called to her husband to come away. "No, but listen to me," said the young man. "If admiration of a pretty face were criminal, I should be the most hopeless and ordinary person alive, for I cannot resist one. It has the most extraordinary effect upon me. It checks and controls me in the most furious or obstinate mood. You see what an effect your pretty face has had upon me already." That's very pretty," replied the young lady, tossing her head. "But—" "Yes, I know it's very pretty," said the young man, looking with an air of admiration into the barmaid's face. "I said so, you know, just this moment. But beauty Beauty should be spoken of respectfully, and in proper terms, and with a becoming sense of its worth and excellence, whereas this fellow has no more notion. The young lady interrupted the conversation at this point by thrusting her head out of the bar window and inquiring of the waiter in a shrill voice whether the young man who had been knocked down was going to stand in the passage all night, or whether the entrance was to be left clear for other people. The waiters, taking the hint and communicating it to the ostlers, were not slow to change their tone, and the result was that the unfortunate victim was bundled out in a twinkling. "I'm sure I've seen that fellow somewhere before," said Nicholas. "Indeed?" replied his new acquaintance. "Oh, I'm certain of it," said Nicholas, pausing to reflect. "Where can I have... Stop! Yes, to be sure. He belongs to a register office up the west of town. I knew I recollected his face." It was indeed Tom, the ugly clerk. "That's odd indeed," said Nicholas, ruminating upon the strange manner in which the register office seemed to start up and stare him in the face every now and then, and when he least expected it. "I am much obliged to you for your advocacy of my cause when it most needed an advocate," said the young man, and laughing, drew a card from his pocket. "Perhaps you will do me the favour to let me know where I can thank you." Nicholas took the card, and glancing at it involuntarily as he returned the compliment, evinced a very great surprise. "Mr. Frank Cheeryble?" said Nicholas. "Surely not the nephew of the Cheeryble brothers, who is expected tomorrow?" "I don't usually call myself the nephew of the firm," returned Mr. Frank good-humouredly, "but of the two excellent individuals who compose it, I am proud to say that I am the nephew. And you, I see, are Mr. Nickleby, of whom I have heard so much. This is a most unexpected meeting, but none the less welcome, I assure you." Nicholas responded to these compliments with others of the same kind, and they shook hands warmly. Then he introduced John Browdie, who had remained in a state of great admiration ever since the young lady and the bar had been so skilfully won over to the right side. Then Mrs. John Browdie was introduced, and finally they all went upstairs together and spent the next half hour with great satisfaction and conversation by declaring that of all the made-up things that she ever saw, that young woman below stairs, adjured Mrs. Browdie, was the vainest and plainest. This Mr. Frank Cheeryble, although to judge from what had recently taken place a hot-headed young man, which is not an absolute miracle and phenomenon in nature, was a sprightly, good-humoured, pleasant fellow, with much both in his countenance and disposition that reminded Nicholas very strongly of the kind-hearted brothers. His manner was as unaffected as theirs, his demeanour full of that heartiness which to most people who have anything generous in their composition is generally prepossessing. And to this, he was good-looking and intelligent, and had a plentiful share of vivacity, was extremely cheerful, and accommodated himself in 5 minutes' time to all John Browdie's oddities with as much ease as if he'd known him from a boy. And it will be a source of no great wonder that when they parted for the night he had produced a most favourable impression not only upon the worthy Yorkshireman and his wife, but also upon Nicholas, who, resolving all these things in his mind as he made the best of his way home, arrived at the condition that he had laid the foundation of a most agreeable and desirable acquaintance. Next morning, when he arrived at the office, he was greeted by Tim Linkinwater, who, unaccountably, appeared to be already acquainted with the events of the previous evening. "Oh, that Mr. Frank and Mr. Nickleby should have met last night!" said Tim Linkinwater, getting slowly off his stool and looking round the counting-house with his back planted against the desk, as was his custom when he had anything particular to say. "That these two young men should be set apart last night, and should have been introduced to one another in that manner. I say, it's a coincidence, a remarkable coincidence." "Well, we may consider ourselves, Brother Ned," said Brother Charles, "very fortunate in having two such young men about us as our nephew Frank and Mr. Nickleby. It should be a source of great satisfaction and pleasure to us." "Certainly, Charles, certainly," returned the other. "Mr. Nickleby," said Brother Charles, calling him aside and taking him kindly by the hand, I am anxious, my dear sir, to see that you are properly and comfortably settled in the cottage. We cannot allow those who serve us well to labour under any privation or discomfort that it is in our power to remove. I wish, too, to meet your mother and sister, to know them, Mr. Nickleby, to make sure that I have an opportunity of relieving their minds by assuring them that any trifling service we have been able to do for them is a great deal more than repaid by the zeal and ardour you display. Not a word, my dear sir, I beg you. Tomorrow is Sunday. I shall make bold to come out at tea time and take the chance of finding you at home. If you're not, or the ladies should feel a delicacy in being intruded upon, and would rather not know me just now, why, I can come again at another time. Any time will do. Let it remain upon that understanding. Brother Ned, my dear fellow, let me have a word with you this way." The twins went out of the office arm in arm, and Nicholas, who saw in this act of kindness and many others which he had been the subject that morning, only so many delicate renewals on the arrival of their nephew of the kind assurances which the brothers had given him in his absence, could scarcely feel sufficient admiration and gratitude for such extraordinary consideration. The intelligence that they were to have a visitor, and such a visitor, the next day, awakened in the breast of Mrs. Nickleby mingled feelings of exultation and regret, for whereas on the one hand she hailed it as an omen of her speedy restoration to good society and the almost forgotten pleasures of morning calls and evening tea drinkings, she could not on the other hand but reflect with bitterness of spirit on the absence of a silver teapot with an ivory knob on the lid, and a milk jug to match, which had been the pride of her heart in days of yore, and had been kept from year's end to year's end wrapped up in wash leather on a certain top shelf, which now presented itself in lively colours to her sorrowing imagination. There was a mighty bustle that night, and a vast quantity of preparation for the expected visitor, and a very large nosegay was brought from a gardener's hard by, and cut up into a number of very small ones, with which Mrs. Nickleby would have garnished the little sitting-room in a style that certainly could not have failed to attract anyone's attention if Kate had not offered to spare her the trouble and arrange them in the prettiest and neatest manner possible. If the cottage ever looked pretty, it must have been on such a bright and sunshiny day as the next day was. But Smike's pride in the garden, or Mrs. Nickleby's in the condition of the furniture, or Kate's in everything, was nothing to the pride with which Nicholas looked at Kate herself. And surely the costliest mansion in all England might have found in her beautiful face and graceful form its most exquisite exquisite and peerless ornament. About 6 o'clock in the afternoon, Mrs. Nickleby was thrown into a great flutter of spirits by the long-expected knock at the door, nor was this flutter at all composed by the audible tread of 2 pairs of boots in the passage, which Mrs. Nickleby assured, in a breathless state, must be the 2 Mr. Cheerybles, and it certainly was, but not the 2 Mr. Cheerybles Mrs. Nickleby expected, because it was Mr. Charles Cheeryble and his nephew, Mr. Frank Cheeryble, who made 1,000 apologies for his intrusion, which Mrs. Nickleby, having teaspoons enough and spare for all, most generously received. Nor did the appearance of this unexpected visitor occasion the least embarrassment, save in Kate, and that only to the extent of a blush or 2 at first, for the old gentleman was so kind and cordial, and the young gentleman imitated him in this respect as well, that the usual stiffness and formality of a first meeting showed no signs of appearing, and Kate really more than once detected in herself the very act of wondering when it was going to begin. At the tea-table there was plenty of conversation on a great variety of subjects, and after tea there was a walk in the garden, and the evening being very fine, they strolled out of the garden gate into some lanes and by-roads, and sauntered up and down until it grew quite dark. This time it seemed to pass very quickly with all the party. Kate went first, leaning upon her brother's arm, and talking with him and Mr. Frank Cheeryble, and Mrs. Nickleby and the elder gentleman followed at a short distance, the kindness of the good merchant, his interest in the welfare of Nicholas, and his admiration for Kate, so operating upon the good lady's feelings that the usual current of her speech was confined within very narrow and circumscribed limits. Smike, who had he ever been an object of interest in his life, had been one that day, accompanied them, joining sometimes one group and sometimes the other, as Brother Charles, laying his hand upon his shoulder, bade him walk with him, or Nicholas, looking smilingly round, beckoned him to come and talk with the old friend who understood him best, and who could win a smile into his careworn face when no one else could. There was a quiet mirth about the little supper, which harmonized exactly with this tone of feeling, and at length the 2 gentlemen took their leave. There was one circumstance in the leave-taking which occasioned a vast deal of smiling and pleasantry, and that was that Mr. Frank Cheeryble offered his hand to Kate twice over, quite forgetting that he had bade her adieu already. This was held by the elder Mr. Cheeryble to be a convincing proof that he was thinking of a young lady with whom he had been affianced in Germany. But the jest occasioned immense laughter. So easy is it to move light hearts. In short, it was a day of serene and tranquil happiness. And as we all have some bright day, many of us, let us hope, among a crowd of others, to which we revert with particular delight, so this one was often looked back upon afterwards as holding a conspicuous place in the calendar of those who shared it. Was there one exception? Was there one who you would expect to have been most happy, who was unhappy? Who was that? Who in the silence of his own chamber sank upon his knees to pray as his first friend had taught him? and folding his hands and stretching them wildly in the air, fell upon his face in a passion of bitter grief. Smike's heart was near to breaking because he saw how Kate and Frank Cheeryble had looked at one another, and he knew that Kate was already beyond his reach.